Iniciamos en 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Adelante.
Buenos días, yo soy Marta Tawil y les doy la más cordial bienvenida a una nueva sesión del Seminario de Estudios sobre el Futuro desde el Centro de Estudios Internacionales del Colegio de México. El día de hoy nos acompaña la doctora Laurence Deschamps-Laporte para discutir en torno al presente y futuro del concepto y la práctica de la política exterior feminista mediante el estudio comparado de México y Canadá. Deschamps-Laporte es directora de investigaciones del CERIU, del Centro de Estudios en Relaciones Internacionales de la Universidad de Montreal, donde también es profesora asistente de ciencia política. Su investigación se centra en política exterior, feminismo, relaciones internacionales y también política de Medio Oriente. Ella fue becaria visitante en el Exeter College y en el Departamento de Política y Relaciones Internacionales de Oxford en 2024. Asesoró a 3 ministros de Relaciones Exteriores canadienses y en 2023 fue nombrada por el Hill Times entre las 50 personas más influyentes de la política canadiense. Anteriormente ofreció asesoramiento estratégico a organizaciones filantrópicas y del sector público globales como consultora de gestión, y tiene un doctorado y una maestría en filosofía de Oxford, donde obtuvo una beca Rhodes. También obtuvo una licenciatura por la University of North Carolina en Chapel Hill, donde fue becaria de Moorhead Cave. Laurence, muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much indeed for accepting our invitation and being with us today. You have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Marta. Buen día a todos. Estoy encantada de estar con ustedes hoy para dar esta conferencia del Seminario de Estudios sobre el Futuro en el Colegio de México virtualmente. Me inspira el objetivo de este seminario que busca promover el cambio y delinear formas alternativas de pensar y construir el futuro en común. Creo que este tema de la política exterior feminista, su ambición, su definición y sus obstáculos, es un tema que ajusta bien a la ambición del seminario. Entonces, como dice Marta, soy directora de investigación de Servicios y profesora, y debo decir que también fui employee en el gobierno canadiense para 4 años. Entonces, esta presentación de una profesora y tengo el contexto político de Canadá también. And now I will no longer torture you, and I will switch to English. All right. But should there be questions in any of the North American 3 main languages, I will welcome them and answer them as well as I can in English or Spanish if I can. So today, my talk is about implementing feminist foreign policy in Canada and Mexico in the midst of national gender crises, a comparative case. I'll split my talk in 3 parts. I'm not sure I will take the full time that you have devoted for this talk, but I'm hoping we can have a dynamic exchange and questions at the end. Of course, the part I'm most excited about is to discuss my hypothesis about Mexico in an audience of experts that maybe can help me further this research project with some insights from the Mexican case. So the first part is about what feminist foreign policies are, what they are supposed to achieve, how they emerge, what are specific about these policies in the moment of their emergence. Then I will outline the Canadian feminist foreign policy, the Mexican foreign policy, and how they compare. And finally, I'll discuss what these policies mean for the future of foreign policy, but also of gender policies nationally for these 2 countries. So starting with the context of feminist foreign policies, I have almost stopped counting the number of countries that have now declared the feminist foreign policies. In fact, there might be over a dozen such feminist foreign policies so far. And what allows me to call feminist foreign policies as such is simply the declaration of having a feminist foreign policies. And of course, there are some good studies of countries that have not used this label and whose foreign policies could be assessed as feminist, and on the other hand, of countries that have declared having a feminist foreign policies at a high level, and of course, who have foreign policies that are seen as inadequate when it comes to the definition of feminism. But in fact, as a good ethnographer, I have to take the governments, the politicians, and the public servants at their own word and compare the label that they have chosen for the feminist policies as the sample of this analysis. The first country to declare a feminist foreign policy was Sweden under the socialist government in 2014. There was nothing particularly surprising about this announcement, given that their foreign minister, Margot Wallström, had been special envoy for the UN Secretary General on sexual violence. There was already a strong plan on UN Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, and they had started gearing their international aid towards ambitious gender transformative aims. But after Sweden, we've seen Canada, France, Spain, Luxembourg, Libya at some point made the declaration, though if we could discuss whether it was in the moment or whether it was meaningful given the governance issues in Libya. Chile, Mexico, I'm trying to think of all of them. Of course, there's quite a few. And then there's other countries like Finland and Australia who have not declared such feminist foreign policies, but who have put gender at the center of their foreign policies. And of course, more recently, probably the most ambitious implementation of feminist foreign policy and the most public has been Germany under Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock. On the one hand, since 2014, we see a multiplication of announcement of feminist foreign policy at the same time as what political scientists and IR specialists have deemed a real crisis of gender internationally. Withdrawal from major international conventions, such as the Istanbul Convention, a total blockage at the UN of raising gender issues, a weakening of the implementation of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, and a global gender backlash, both nationally and internationally, and female politicians, though growing in number globally, feeling much more targeted by anti-women and generally anti-gender backlash. And in a sense, how do we make sense of the emergence of this foreign policy in this anti-gender moment we are living through? We were hosting at the Cerium recently Jennifer Thompson, who's a professor at the University of Bath and who's written quite a bit about that. And she has a new book coming out. And I agree with her assessment is this dichotomy of gender backlash and feminist foreign policy is not an oddity, but in fact is an explanation of their emergence. In the face of backlash, the commitment, at least symbolically, to feminism seems more urgent and also can be assessed as strategic for many governments. So there is a question regarding, does feminism need a crisis to exist? I will let you, in terms of what you study, propose your answer, but in the case of feminist foreign policy, they do seem to coexist in their emergence. We were speaking for a long time, and this was something Jennifer was also engaging with in her work, with the idea of a glass cliff for women politicians and women in politics. And now some are also speaking of a glass cliff. And of course, I'd be curious to hear my colleague on this conference view of Mexican politics, but it does seem that in many countries, and perhaps we will see if it's a cliff or if it's not in the United States. Yes, women come to power, become heads of the party, but sometimes in the most desperate of political times. In the biggest crisis of inflation, environmental crisis, they are the politician of la dernière chance. Some who study the place of women in politics and say, we give women their moment when it seems impossible to win, or it seems impossible to address the governance issues of the day. So it's no longer a question of glass ceiling, but a question of glass cliff. And there is two other factors to take in consideration in the emergence of feminist foreign policies. The first one is that they also can be assessed as strategic. Whether they do pay out at the polls in the end is another question, but towards national audiences, surely in the Canadian case, this analysis was very strong, that Justin Trudeau was trying to announce feminist policies internationally, especially to gain and maintain the support of women constituencies throughout Canada. The second argument is that there is a group of not only middle powers, but mostly middle powers who've affirmed their strong feminist foreign policies. When I say not only, I don't think we could say that France is a middle power. By and large, the countries who've adopted them are middle powers. And it becomes strategic for certain middle powers who are torn between different political forces to project a feminist foreign policy to be part of this middle power club of value projection. The harshest critique would call it value signaling. That could be the case of countries like Chile, for example, but also people have been talking about Mongolia making signals to feminist foreign policies as a way to divert from the high pressure between China and India and associate more, be invited at another table at the UN, for example. In the end, there is no doubt that feminist foreign policies are objects of liberalism and norms projection. And what is most typical in the definition of feminist foreign policy is there is no definition of what feminism means. And in a sense, it seems to be a silence that is deemed as strategic by the government to announce feminist foreign policies. Defining feminism might lead to very harsh critique of the definition of feminism, especially as in many countries, definitions of feminism vary greatly between generations. I can say in Quebec and Canada, that's definitely the case. And a younger generation that identify as feminist tend to have different definition or broader than their mother. But is it completely surprising that feminist foreign policies are objects of norm projection? In fact, diplomacy tends to be an act of norms projection by and large. Other strong Canadian policies in the past, such as the idea of human security or different other internationalist brands of foreign policy, of course, were associated with programs, but were also attempts at norms projection for middle powers like Canada. The realm of what is included in feminist foreign policy varies greatly. Typically, again, there is a lack of clarity on the boundaries of what falls into it, and this could be strategically helpful. I have been debating with some of my French colleagues, but also people in the government, why does the French say la diplomatie féministe and not la politique étrangère féministe? And well, they say, you Quebecers, you speak like North American French. We think diplomacy is the word for foreign policy in French. It doesn't mean it's limited to the diplomatic realm. Of course, it is expensive. So in fact, like anything in politics, many people could have many definitions. And in fact, the intention is probably hoping that whoever supports this definition might put the definition that most pleases them under that umbrella. The critiques of feminist foreign policies are similar and numerous, and they focus on what civil society and many feminist scholars would call the hypocrisies of feminist foreign policies. And in terms of major OECD aid donors, global North countries, such as the Scandinavians, Canada, it's always about the main critiques are what is feminist is aid and the representation of women in the diplomatic service. And don't take me wrong, this is important, but they say it's limited. It's too limited to speak of feminism. And what is left out is arms trades, a defense relation, the hypocrisy of the extractive industries, for example, of Canada's mine and Latin America, and the displacement of population and the environmental impact of Canadian industries. That is, in fact, the footprint of Canada abroad, but is not put forward as part of foreign policy, though it could be if you were expensive in your definition. But the main critique, and I think this is why comparing Canada and Mexico is so relevant, is the tension between crises that women are going through nationally and this profession of a feminist foreign policies abroad. People say you pinkwash your reputation abroad in international fora to cover up the fact that there is a crisis of gender and women in your country. In the case of Canada, that crisis that is most prominent is a crisis of femicide, that Indigenous women are the main victim. And that crisis is it's both historic and contemporary and has never ended. There was a commission called the Commission for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. So I will now refer it to the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. There is also, of course, other crises related to gender. And there is a crisis of femicide that is not solely Indigenous. There has been, during COVID and after COVID, a sharp rise in femicide, intimate partner violence, that leads to the assassination of women. However, in terms of the core of the tension, the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis can be compared because of its marginalization from public discourse, because of the tension with security forces in Canada of different levels, a little bit like Mexico, to the crisis of femicide in the northern states, mostly disappeared women in Mexico. Before I move on to the actual comparison, I'll say one last thing about what were these feminist foreign policy born from? This concept was not invented in 2014. In fact, when you dig in, as I will do in a minute, you find out that they are an amalgamation of different pre-existing policies, often an expansion on implementation plan, national action plan in the UN parlance on Resolution 1325, which is the UN resolution on women, peace, and security. When I speak of 1325, I encompass all the other women, peace, and security resolution that have come afterwards to press for its implementation, to call for new targets, to call the Secretary General under Ban Ki-moon, ask for countries to develop these national action plan, anyone in the national, not just on the Security Council, any country at the UN to publish plans on its implementation. A lot of the feminist foreign policy have built on 1325. Of course, because of the Swedish blueprint and because of Margot Wallström work on sexual violence, quite a bit of these feminist foreign policy also focus on combating sexual violence worldwide. And are these feminist foreign policies a creation of the global north, a cooptation, a way of imposing a specific definition of feminism? Yes and no, in the sense that it could be used that way. And sometimes the fluidity on definition of feminism, knowing that it's quite a definition is lacking to begin with, so it's often assumed in the subtext to be a liberal North definition of feminism. And in fact, many scholars have emphasized the focus on the economic empowerment of women as being key in these feminist foreign policy, which brings back to this liberal capitalist view of a feminism that increases the GDP. However, when you read about the emergence of 1325 of the UN Security Council in the year 2000, it's quite obvious that the promoters and those who most mobilized for its emergence were global South countries, namely countries like Bangladesh, Namibia. And they were born from the effort of the Beijing Conference. That was a strong moment for Southern feminists, civil society. In that sense, I think it is important to stay nuanced and not also remove the legacy of these very important Southern feminists, especially post-apartheid mobilization, where women's movements were really strong in Southern Africa and in some of the first peacekeeping missions in Namibia, for example. Their contribution to 1325 and what will then begin in part feminist foreign policies is clear, yet not always recognized. When we compare, so I'm now in my second part, when we compare Mexico and Canada, it's quite, and now I'm referencing work that I've done with my co-author Bénédicte Santoire, and a chapter that will come out in a book with Bristol University Press shortly. So I want to acknowledge that this is not only my work. When we compare Canada and Mexico, first, this comparison is not only important because of the tension with the crises of femicide, but a lot of this analysis has focused on the European continent, where the concept was most popularized. Yet in the North American space, Canada and Mexico stand out, and often we can understand the emergence of these feminist foreign policies as also, when I say correlated or response to crisis, as emerging under the Trump presidency. It is not, and this is where the importance of national audiences is also important. The rise of misogynist discourse, and I'm sure Mexicans are like Canadians in that we consume American media and American news perhaps as much as we consume news about our own country. As such, the rise of misogynist discourse under the Trump presidency created a space for Canada and Mexico to affirm a different way. The path of development of policy has been a bit different. In a sense, when Canada started speaking of a feminist foreign policy, it had done two things prior. It had announced quite an ambitious national action plan on women, peace, and security prior. The second plan on 1325, that some said it goes beyond the realm of what is considered what belongs to peace and security. It was criticized by those who feel most at risk or not at peace in Canada, that is, Indigenous communities and other marginalized women, for being way too outward focused and not focusing enough on the situation in Canada. In fact, there is quite a diversity of approaches to National Action Plan on 1325. Some countries focus it as an international agenda, some use it as a national agenda, and some do a mix of both. Canada had also announced something that we call the FIAP, the Feminist International Aid Policy. When the Trudeau government came in power, Marie-Claude Bibeau was the first development minister, did a full review of the aid policy. And out of quite robust civil society consultation, decided to focus all of the aid, 95%, on gender goals and called it feminist foreign policy. Then Chrystia Freeland started affirming a feminist foreign policy. However, there has never been a policy document, a blueprint published about what it entails. Mexico announces feminist foreign policy without having published national plan on 1325. It did, in fact, then publish a Women, Peace, and Security Implementation Plan about a year afterwards. It was announced under Ebrard, and it was Delgado, who was the main spokesperson for this policy, who in fact also wrote a paper that was quite academic sounding to explain what it entails. But in fact, despite on the foreign policy itself, if you leave alone aid or other 1325 plans, Canada and Mexico are quite similar in that they both have very light documentation of what this feminist foreign policy entails. I also argue, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in the question period, that while Canada and Mexico have affirmed having feminist foreign policy in this Trump era, aside from their national political audiences, the countries have projected these feminist foreign policies toward different global audiences. Canada's wanted to, without this being overtly said, wanted to be associated with a Scandinavian type country, especially in the context of his UN Security Council campaign, which it didn't win, but it wanted to have a similar reputation as Scandinavian countries on the international scene. My hypothesis is that, in fact, Mexico was trying to affirm itself more as a leader of a non-aligned, reaffirm itself global South, that it was lacking leadership. This was associated also with strong discourse on migration, on welcoming, on having included Southern intellectuals from countries like Haiti, Venezuela, other Latin American countries, and its realm. I think this was particularly interesting because this came after a moment where Mexico was a leader in the negotiation for a global pact on global migration. And while this never really came to be as the legally binding or even in terms of a symbolic pact at the UN, and there was a lot of backlash, especially in Europe, Mexico really held in this UN forum before declaring a feminist foreign policy quite an internationalist discourse on global migration.
Ay, ¿se les detuvo a todos? ¿Hola?
Sí, se detuvo.
Sí, se detuvo y ya no vemos a Lorenz.
Ah,
Supongo que
¿será
es una
de,
cuestión
¿será de
local.
ella?
Sí,
Debe ser ella, porque todos
Ella.
los demás están
ella
corriendo
ya
bien.
Fue.
salió ahorita, sí. A ver si regresa. Ay,
I apologize, my Wi-Fi
Ah,
dropped at the
okay.
university. Okay,
problem.
I hope it was not offline too long.
No.
So I hypothesized that Mexico was also trying to claim a mantle of global leadership, especially toward global South country, that were no longer accepting this liberal value signaling from global North country. At a moment where multilateralism was losing speed, Mexico has been trying to claim it as something that can be appropriated and adapted to Latin America and the global South. Finally, when you look at it's quite interesting because there's this global discourse, but when you look at the documents that do exist for Mexico, it's mostly focused on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And it focuses on internal policies and on gender policies and nonviolent policies and diversity within the diplomatic service. So there's a little bit of a dichotomy between what we were seeing in international fora from Mexico in that period of emergence and what could be linked to this appropriation and declaration of a feminist foreign policy. And what's actually written in the text has tended to be more focused on internal foreign affairs policies. And in a sense, is this worse or is this better? That's not my job anymore, but it's quite interesting because one of the main criticism of global North country, and of course, Mexico is North American, but it kind of globally in this multilateral system adopts both of these identities, depending on the fora and the moment and the leadership it wants to project. Canada was very declarative and really outward focus in its feminist foreign policy. So is France, though, in a similar way. It was never written. So is it in fact that Mexico is mostly looking at its own foreign service could also be interpreted as humble and realistic, but much as still to be seen in terms of implementation. And I will now go on to what does that mean for the future of foreign policy. Of course, if the moment was that of crisis, feminist foreign policies are always quite vulnerable to political change. And I often have this discussion with NGO that receive government funding that feel quite strongly that though there is a cooptation and some hypocrisies, the fact in Canada, I shall not minimize that. There is a lot of aid that is focused on reproductive rights, on empowerment, on political participation. Of course, these programs are not without obstacles. Think about the fact that Canada's funded a lot of empowerment program in Afghanistan, and now what has become of these Afghan leaders that Canada supported. Despite all the obstacle, I think I can leave the academic analysis moment to say, I'll still rather take that kind of aid than aid that would be linked to mining investment, for example, which has existed in the history of Canada. Is something called tied aid to Canadian industries abroad. It's not without its fault, but it's still the best we got if you believe in gender equality and feminism. That being said, the conservative are rising in Canada, and this is not unlike political change that we're seeing in Europe. Sweden no longer has a feminist foreign policy, though they didn't announce that the feminist foreign policy is dead. They just said now it's pragmatic and strategic and clean the website. In Mexico, you are living through a different political moment with a female president from a same party. So I think this moment is quite critical to watch in terms of implementation, expansion. And I must say that globally, yes, it's often female foreign ministers or female heads of state that have announced feminist foreign policies and feminist policies, though it can also, in certain cases, be perceived by these female politicians as putting a bigger target on their forehead. In some cases, we see some female minister not claiming outright the language of feminism has to try to protect themselves against greater gender backlash. Does that work? Does that not work? It's really hard to track. But the fact is that there is a lot of hatred, especially online, for female politicians. So it's not because you're a progressive female politician that by default you will think it's strategic to claim this label. No, if there is political change in sight, like Canada, is it more strategic to become coy on your feminist ambition, or should you affirm them? Nothing can protect against backlash. In that sense, trying to talk about maternal health and international aid, if what you really want to do is offer the diversity of reproductive health services, does not protect you from cutting aid on abortion, for example, your ability to program internationally in countries. Because often countries cannot change policies at home, but they can curtail certain kinds of aids to countries abroad. Canada's invested. When Trump cut a lot of the USAID aid on reproductive health, Canada, in I think the next 10 days, announced $650 million to try to fill the gap in some of these cases. So these programs have become kind of this push and pull where other countries can step in. Federica Mogherini, when she was at the EU, announced the SPARK program, which was globally against sexual violence and violence against women at a time when a lot of far-right governments in the world were withdrawing from the Istanbul Convention. In the case of femicides, my new project looks at the possibility of feminist foreign policies being used as a political lever or as a platform to argue and to negotiate for progress on these crises. What is quite particular is the stakeholders that are the closest to these crises, the organization, the women leaders, those who mobilize on solving the crisis of femicide, In the Canadian case, of course, Indigenous women and Indigenous organizations and Indigenous communities. From what I understand from the Mexican situation, and please do add in the comments afterwards, is that battle is often in state courts by individual trailblazing women who take the cases on behalf of the families to find the bodies, defend the families, find the culprits, etc. These who are closest to these causes of femicide tend not to engage with this concept of feminist foreign policy and see it as a distraction from what is most pressing in their country. However, there tends to be civil society organization, national NGO, international NGO like that do development abroad, in the Canadian case, Save the Children, Oxfam, etc., who want to preserve funding on gender causes and the ambition of feminism, yet call on their governments to be coherent between their national policies and their international policies. In this case, these organizations try to act as intermediaries to negotiate a gender norm that is never perfect, but that allows to both preserve feminist ambitions abroad and improve them, but also try to negotiate with national organization or include the national organization that really fight these crises of femicides, to say we need progress on this as well. As such, my new project looks at the possibility of a gender norms negotiation process that is often led in the capital, and that is often led by intermediaries that find the international ambition perhaps imperfect, but still useful internationally, yet have a commitment to see gender policies improve in their country. And can there be a space fueled on perhaps the risk of international loss of perdre la face, we would say in French, but let's say humiliation, though humiliation is probably too strong. Countries, when there's a UN commission that comes to Canada to investigate the case of missing and murdered Indigenous women, it's not a good political day in Ottawa. In that case, could this tension be a lever for change? Could feminist foreign policy, in fact, lead to more mobilization, more international attention, more transnational feminist coalition building in national policy? This is, to me, the greatest question that these policies hold. And perhaps, if I'm able to be optimistic for a moment, the greatest, yet unfulfilled, but the greatest promise that could be embedded in them if mobilized carefully. So I will now stop talking, and I'm very happy to discuss anything that I've said. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Laurence, for this insightful presentation. A mí me vinieron varias preguntas a la mente, pero bueno, quisiera primero dar la palabra al público, a mis colegas, para que formulen las suyas o planteen sus comentarios. Veo acá, ¿qué mano veo? Bueno, tenemos aquí las preguntas de un colega, del profesor Nail Martínez, which are, why is the term feminist foreign policy used instead of gender-sensitive foreign policy? What implications does this terminological choice carry? What are the conceptual and practical differences between a feminist foreign policy and one that is gender-sensitive? To what extent does feminist foreign policy encompass or promote other progressive agendas such as LGBTQ+ rights or environmentalism? And his final question, how are issues of sexual diversity integrated into the framework of feminist foreign policy? I don't know if you would like to answer these four, or maybe I can make a round of 3 questions.
Sorry, I was also like thinking
I thought you were not here. I'm sorry.
a few other things running here, but I was also thinking related with Annalena Baerbock and also like the Canadian foreign policy. You know, like I don't necessarily, I'm familiar with this framework in different contexts, including, unfortunate, the Mexican case. But, I know a little bit about like Annalena Baerbock agenda, and I know, how interconnected with these other aspects and like the debates between the feminist movement related with the use of feminism rather than gender perspective. So yeah, I'm just, wanna, I would like to have your opinion related to this stuff.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Nin Martinez. These are great questions. And these, of course, questions that scholars and civil society ask all the time of their own governments who've claimed these labels. So I'm going to offer my read as a scholar rather than a clear answer that comes from the government, because often these do not exist in a clear way. It seems that the call for gender mainstreaming, which has not been done in many cases, has in fact led to the loss of popularity of claiming gender programming. In fact, also in Canada, there's two nuances to think about when we think about feminism. First, the word gender, though academics, we do whatever we want and we use it in French, genre, doesn't officially exist as something else than grammar. So we still say, and I think I'd be curious to see how it's evolved in its use in Spanish, but we still say the UN documents for gender will still translate as égalité homme-femme for gender equality. Scholars of feminism, we use the word genre, but it's not officially accepted as a translation we have our own French Academy in Quebec, but neither of the academies that we could refer to accept it. So in a sense, there's also a rhetorical problem with claiming something that's bigger than equality between men and women as an agenda for transformation that is more than equality, that is about transforming society and the modes of power within it. There lacks the word in French, which politicians would not really talk about genre because that would be seen as very academic and odd in French. But also, it's seen at feminism is seen as a political word that is could be provoking, and in fact, I think the intent was to embrace it. What has led many scholars will then say it's led to its depolitization, because feminism is supposed to be, in these experts' view, a movement from the ground up that calls truth to power. Once power and once government claims it, it leads to the shallowing out of the term. So the ambition was to differentiate themselves from what is technical development programming language of gender sensitive or gender OECD assessment of aid, and to speak in what was to some provoking or more revolutionary political words. Over 10 years after the declaration of Sweden Feminist Foreign Policy, as it led to revolution, or as it led to a co-optation of the term, I think the jury's out. I'll let each of you make their mind about that. But I think it was clear that gender was not going to cut it in that moment for these political, for the discourse these politicians wanted to embrace. Second of all, it's not clear what feminism is in terms of gender sensitive. But in aid, the way we assess aid is still international metric that speak about gender, but what does gender sensitive means in diplomacy? What does gender sensitive means in defense? I think these are not very clear and well defined outside of development. So feminists can become an impulse for ambition, or can become this umbrella that we're not sure what goes in, but it seems not to cut it, especially in the realm of foreign policy. In fact, you know, the feminist scholars say, well, if you do feminist diplomacy, you should really not be meeting with the G7 all the time. Like, how is one of your most important international fora a fora that's defined by the biggest GDP in the 90s? That's not very feminist. You should be meeting all the time with smaller countries, for Canada, countries in your hemisphere, countries in the Caribbean, where like half of your population goes every winter, that are very at risk by global change, by climate change, that go through these tornadoes all the time, where a lot of the leaders have been educated in your schools in Canada. So in a sense, it's not been well defined, but if you had to define it, most feminist scholars would say that it's not being implemented. What I've seen in diplomatic circle, and what I've been part of, and what I think is also to open up the table in diplomatic meeting for civil society. And it's also to, in some way, meet with other leaders, not just when you need a UN Security Council seat, but meet with Congo. Don't just send some official. So it's not been done enough, but gender sensitive would not carry that political ambition in the realm of defense or diplomacy. And for the last question, LGBT rights have started to show up in the documents that exist in various countries about feminist foreign policies. What does that mean? Generally, it's mostly LGBT plus two plus by spirit also in Canada, programming and the development funding and the embassies for groups, especially in authoritarian contexts that support these kinds of groups. Also means having mechanism and better HR practices for queer families, and when they're deployed, helping them get deployed to posting where they'll be safe, having better policies. It's still not enough, but it tends to be included more and more in the plans and also in the policies. Environmentalism is still a bit of a blind spot. And that's what a lot of the eco-feminists have been calling for. And in Canada, it comes together with discussing the role of the Canadian mining industry. So I'm hoping, about Annalena Baerbock, I think what's quite particular about the way she speaks about foreign policy, and I find it quite enlightening. Some German scholars have told me, oh, that's very German, but is she actually tends to speak about the tensions that exist. When she decided to send arms to Ukraine, she spoke about the dilemma she was traversing. She doesn't, in fact, foreign policy is always full of decision that cannot always be coherent as a whole. And what's been striking about the way Annalena Baerbock has been speaking of foreign policy is she doesn't shy away from the contradiction, but in fact speaks about that dilemma overtly, which doesn't solve it, but is refreshing politically.
Thank you so much. Were great answers.
Thank you. Thank you. Luisi Pedrosa?
Thank you, Marta. I maybe would like to defer my place in the line to Elodie, who needs to leave soon. If she wants to
Right. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Elodie. I didn't see your hand. Entonces pensé que no estabas lista. Adelante.
No te preocupes. Muchas gracias, Luisi. Muchas gracias, Laurence, por su presentación. Voy a responder en español, a ver si eso fomenta reacciones también de las personas que puedan estar en línea. Bueno, su presentación genera muchísimas oportunidades de diálogo para pensar también el caso de México, y hacia ahí van a ir mis reacciones muy rápidamente, porque pues son varias, pero la contradicción entre la situación interna y la agenda de política exterior que usted señaló es algo clásico en México, que también existe para derechos humanos, migración, minorías. porque la política exterior de México, mediante el cuerpo diplomático, me refiero a esta élite de actores,
Sí.
suele defender valores liberales. Es algo de la retórica oficial. Y la justificación que yo escuché frente a esta contradicción es que el trabajo diplomático no puede limitarse a lo que pasa adentro, porque un objetivo es también en el futuro que haya un efecto boomerang en México. A ver si ese trabajo ayuda a promover causas dentro de México. Ese es mi primer comentario. Pero el problema que yo vi en el gobierno anterior es una tensión, una contradicción dentro del mismo gobierno, con una Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores que promueve la política exterior feminista y un gobierno a través del presidente que ha tenido una relación muy difícil con grupos feministas, también con madres buscadoras, y que ha podido tomar decisión de cortar fondos de programas de apoyo de protección a las mujeres, ¿no? Entonces, ahí yo veo una contradicción aún más mayor, digo, más difícil de resolver retóricamente, ¿no?
¿Y usted piensa que la situación puede cambiar ahora, esta tensión?
Hay dos elementos, el hecho de tener una presidenta
Sí.
y pero, a ver. En el discurso de cuando tomó, cuando inició su mandato, ella insistió mucho en las mujeres, pero también evitó hablar de algunas temáticas complejas, ¿no? Entonces, vamos a ver. Pero en el último gobierno fue una contradicción muy fuerte. Mi tercer comentario, cuando usted mencionó una crítica posible a la política exterior feminista es esa imposición de norte a sur. Yo creo que esa lectura sobre el viaje de los valores liberales en el mundo ahora es un poco simplista, porque ya hay muchos trabajos de colegas historiadores de relaciones exteriores sobre América Latina y Asia en particular, que han demostrado que países de esas regiones, que en ese momento no se hablaba de sur, pero al finalizar la Segunda Guerra Mundial, han sido clave en la construcción de esos valores liberales. Entonces, el liberalismo también pertenece y es producido por países del sur. Sí. Eso se ha demostrado. Entonces, no es de sorprender. A mí no me ha sorprendido que la política exterior feminista sea elaborada al mismo tiempo en sur y en norte. No digo que a veces no hay imposiciones de normas, sí, pero no siempre. Y yo diría que es importante poner esto en perspectiva. Mi cuarto comentario sobre, usted dijo una hipótesis sobre las ambiciones de liderazgo de México. En los últimos 30 años, México oficialmente ha evitado, pero de manera explícita, emplear el vocabulario de sur o sur global. Lo ha evitado. Ha sido un líder en muchas negociaciones colectivas, eso estoy de acuerdo. Hay muchas, alta mar, migración, drogas, pero no ha usado esta posición para proyectarse como un líder del sur, en diferencia con Brasil. Y ahí la retórica oficial nuevamente es que México es un país constructivo que ayuda a elaborar normas y no es un país crítico como Brasil, ¿no? Se diferencian mucho en eso cuando usted habla con diplomáticos.
Eso está muy interesante. ¿Y usted cree que México quiere construir una política exterior feminista que está diferente del norte o que está en coherencia con la política de los países de Europa, en su opinión?
Yo creo que más en coherencia por la visión ideológica de las personas que defienden este proyecto. Por eso reciben críticas también desde México.
Sí, interesante.
Pero bueno, eso se tendría que comprobar con el tiempo, ¿no? Recientemente México ha anunciado que quiere regresar al G77, que es la coalición de países del sur en las Naciones Unidas, a ver si esto significa un ajuste en su política exterior. Pero si vemos la trayectoria de los últimos 30 años, mi hipótesis sería que usted no va a poder confirmar su hipótesis. Pero bueno, es una hipótesis de una hipótesis, así que a lo mejor puede no estar de acuerdo conmigo, ¿no? Y el último comentario sobre qué es una política exterior feminista, lo que me parece interesante es que en América Latina también existe un feminismo conservador. Históricamente en las iglesias católicas, por ejemplo. Y también en el gobierno de Bolsonaro, la ministra de la Familia tenía una retórica de defensa de las mujeres. Entonces, mi punto que es aquí, que más que una disputa para decir si importa la promoción y la visibilidad de las mujeres, va a ser una disputa sobre qué normas hay que defender. ¿Cómo las definimos, no? Ahora en México sigue un gobierno similar al anterior, pero Brasil en esto ha sido muy interesante. Obviamente, para la comunidad feminista más de izquierda en América Latina, esas mujeres no se pueden calificar como feministas. Pero, pues esas mujeres retoman ciertas palabras que les permiten posicionar sus ideas. Pues ahí hay pues, un problema de reconocimiento entre grupos y de la agenda que se va a ir promoviendo. Pero creo que es algo que no hay que olvidar. Y en Francia lo pensé, porque usted mencionó Francia, pues también ha sido importante este feminismo conservador en algunos momentos en la política interna. Y en el gobierno actual es muy importante.
Sí.
Entonces, muy bien. Bueno, estas serían mis reacciones. Muchas gracias, fue muy interesante. Muy interesante su pregunta.
No, merci, Elodie. Just in 30 seconds.
Oui, yes, of course.
Non, c'était très intéressant, and I'm taking notes because this is work in progress, and part of my desire to engage is to hear from perhaps not scholars of Mexico, all of you, but scholars who know a lot about Mexico through other realms. I think I agree with everything you say. So my question is and it's a question that we don't need to answer now, but that remains with me is, without claiming a South-South leadership.
Otra vez.
Oh, se nos congeló.
De nuevo. Bueno, ahora volverá. Y ya te doy después a
Y
ti.
me encantó tu argumento de reivindicar el liberalismo del sur. Sí,
Lean a Roberto Breña más atrás, para que vean las fuentes diversas del liberalismo.
Hoy nos regresa. Ahí está, ¿no?
Apologies, I will write to our IT people to complain. No, so how this relationship is evolving without claiming the rhetorics of South-South leadership is interesting. I think there is no doubt that conservative feminism is not only present, but is on the rise. What I'm seeing from the Canadian members of parliaments that could fall in that category. In the US, there's even a big youth trad wife trend of women going back to these very classic gender roles. Is, while this is strong and they use a rhetoric on women, they do not use the word feminism because they see it as the disease. So this trend is strong, and it's always been strong in politics. And in fact, under some Bush, Harper, we've seen a big rise in funding for women's health, but women's having babies, basically. Yeah, so with quite big limits on what can be funded. So I don't think this is going anywhere. I think it's changing in form, but I still don't see the language of feminism being used, even though I think the label feminist is claimed in a very overt way by specific players that are not conservative. And finally, I totally agree with you, Elodie, that in fact, a lot of the feminist norms, leave alone other international, come from mobilizations of feminists in Latin America and Bangladesh and Namibia that I've named. However, this is not always recognized. And in fact, this history is often a silence when these norms are reclaimed. So I would be interested to see when we study the evolution of the discourse in Mexico, whether that legacy is acknowledged in Mexico at all, because perhaps they could do what others haven't done. I see that there have been celebration of by the Foreign Ministry of Mexican feminist icons and of independence that have been claimed in some of the documentation by the Foreign Ministry, which I thought was interesting. But thank you so much, Elodie, and I've taken lots of notes.
Thank you. Great. Luisi Pedrosa?
Thank you, Marta. Thank you for this wonderful conference, Laurence. I have one comment that follows up a little bit on what Elodie just said, but picking up the point of migration policy that you mentioned shortly, as you know, is Mexico trying to package several agendas that are perceived as progressive in order to project itself or something like that? And I would advise being careful with the timeline when you construct this argument, because properly this very intense diplomatic effort on the side of Mexico in pushing for the global compact for migration is previous to, of course, the entry of Marcelo Ebrard to the foreign ministry and the declaration of a feminist foreign policy. And it's very key and it's crystal clear that the moment that he enters as a minister, there is probably an overlap of a couple of weeks in which these agendas might have coincided, but then quickly the migration thing is dropped. Because in the light of the circumstances of MPP, of Title 42 that fortified the border between the US and Mexico, Mexico ended up accepting, taking back asylum seekers, refuge seekers that were heading towards the US or heading north, simply accepting them back in Mexico. And this has been the beginning of an incredible pushback on migration policy inside Mexico that makes this agenda internationally not credible at all. So it has been dropped. So just that let's say comment on how these things might have come together, but then very quickly fallen apart from each other. And my question to you would be, what are your steps for research? How do you plan to move forward? Because I think you have the stuff here for a wonderful comparative empirical project that could try to separate what are the minimal commonalities across these feminist foreign policy agendas. Do they limit themselves to the UN Resolution 1325, or in which aspects do they go beyond? And especially what is own to and particular to each country? What makes it part of the feminist agenda of foreign policy? I think that would be a great way to try to find out whether the main purpose, if I understood correctly from your talk, is internal signaling or external projection of something. But it would also help us clarify many other super interesting questions that are open about what is the content of a feminist foreign policy. In Germany, for example, I have some anecdotal evidence from colleagues who are active, for example, within the Green Party, which is Annalena Baerbock's party, and they reveal there are like bottom-up discussions in the party ranks about what should be the content of the foreign policy with a feminist perspective. And in the context of Germany, which is very particular because of its foreign policy tradition after the Second World War, it seems that the emancipatory potential of a feminist foreign policy is being interpreted in a way that tries to gain some spaces for independence for German foreign policy, you know, in trying to push for agendas that are more that are closer to indigenous communities, to local and regional circumstances, and that give it some degrees of freedom or independence from the North Atlantic US American foreign policy interests. That's what I'm trying to say here. So it might very well be that the interpretation of this, in the end, this transformative or emancipatory potential of a foreign policy is used and interpreted very differently across countries. And it would be fascinating to find out what are these different contents in different regions according to their power constellations and histories.
No, thank you so much, Lucy. I think these are great points. I guess what I'm interested in is, from a foreign policy, as you say, if there was an end of the leadership role internationally on migration, and maybe you correct me, I feel like this discourse, these internal political discourse on this society that's welcoming to migrants, that's different from the US in a sense, and the rhetorics, was still politically embraced, while even though there was an interruption of the formal policy. So I'd be understanding, and of course, a lot of this is rhetorical, which I'm comfortable studying. I don't have, of course, I have to limit myself to studying everything that's perfectly coherent. There's not going to be a lot to study. But so I'm kind of interested in understanding, despite this interruption internationally, was this discourse still embraced by this government and by in this new election? Will it continue to be of Mexico as a diverse society that has been welcoming to and continues to be welcoming in the face of crisis in the broader region, while other countries are closing up? So that's something I'm thinking about. The second thing is, in terms of steps for research, I'm quite interested in what you're saying and what feminist foreign policies means for a different government. And I think there's a bit of quite interesting work that's being done on this, and some collective books coming out, including comparing the German case and this Bristol University Press book. I have different case studies from different countries. There's still not enough on Mexico and Chile and on Latin America, unfortunately. So I call on all your good graduate students to write about it. But in fact, we're stuck with what is unwritten, what is claimed, what is programmed. But so I think that's interesting, but I've become interested in something quite different, which is studying this process of negotiation, speaking to feminist organizations nationally to see which of them completely reject the idea of a feminist foreign policy, don't want to engage, which of them want to show up to consultation, who gets invited to the consultation in Mexico and Canada. Because even for 1325, when they developed the plan, there was a list of Mexican organizations that were invited, but some of them seem to have maybe been coalition created technically in the moment of this plan. So which of them have real grassroots support? And do some organization and women leaders, also independent feminist intellectuals who might have influence, act as mediators between those who rejected because their cause is still interesting. So I'm trying to map a comparative pathway of gender norms negotiation, for which feminist foreign policy creates a platform, but of really questioning the internal and the external and how norms are expressed and negotiated between different constituencies. So hopefully, I think because of the similar extremely grave crisis, these processes seem most striking in Canada and Mexico, because, for example, Germany has a lot of gender crises, like all countries, of course, but there is less of a predominant issue that is national that can be held ahead of the others. And in that sense, Canada and Mexico are similar. And also, I think the main tension for Germany is the question of demilitarization. That is even in feminist IR, that's the biggest question, is feminism in IR is demilitarization. And this is why the Green Party and Annalena Baerbock in this post-World War II heritage of demilitarization, gradual, not complete peacekeeping, but specific tasks, is in this moment of crisis, because a lot of these countries, including, have been remilitarizing. And that's, I suppose, true of Mexico as well. So that tension is real and is across the board in this moment. But what I'm trying to study at this moment is that negotiation between actor and how it is constructed and how actors are mapped out. And can they find a space of coexistence on some parts of a gender norm that could be consensual, or is it impossible? And in fact, by default, the international and the national remain divorced. So, but thank you, Lucy.
Thank you. Wonderful. Yo, súper rápido, I just was thinking about this concept when you're talking about the South-South and all these discussions we've been having about, you know, the need of projecting like a certain role. Make me think of this concept of national role conception, of a country's national role conception. And I don't know if you've read this article, Amnon Aran and Klaus Brummer recently published in the European Journal of International Security about feminist foreign policy in Israel and Germany. And they explore the relationship between a feminist foreign policy and a country's national role conception. And now we were talking about Germany, and in Israel's role perceptions, there is a militarized, power-oriented, very realist traits in this national role conception, much more stronger than the civilian ones. And Germany, country, it has seen many foreign policy roles ascribed to its sense reunification, predominantly that of a civilian power, which contains also several guiding principles. So I don't know if you, I think those elements are present in your research. So I would think that this discussion is useful when comparing Canadian.
Yeah, no, I'll make sure to read it.
Yeah.
That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, because I think of Mexico's, I don't know what Mexico's national role conception is. It depends also, of course, on the political elite or the relevant, politically irrelevant elite, which defines the status nationalist or national identity. But I would say it's a North American country. Neoliberal is not a South-South country. It is not perceived as doesn't perceive itself as that. And this, in principle, would be compatible with the feminist foreign policy. But ultimately, the specific levels of commitment and or intensity shown in the pursuit of these goals, well, that depends on other factors, and like perhaps one or two, like party politics or inter-bureaucratic dynamics, dynamics between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and others, like and the army as well. which I think will be very important in the following, years for Mexico, for your Mexican case. Sí.
Thank you, Marta. And
Sí.
what a lot of scholars have paid attention to, which I'm hoping to identify more clearly in Canada and Mexico, is not only the interaction with civil society intermediary, but what we call femocrats. So those public servants that are able to pursue ambitious gender aim, but fit them in the agenda of the day to ensure that that feminist goals are still being pursued while adapting to the political moment. Long-term public servants that are objective, and how they do this as also a negotiation act is also part of this process of the existence and work of femocrats and bureaucracies, including foreign ministries. But thank you, Marta.
Wonderful, wonderful. Sí, sí, sí. Muy bien. ¿Alguien más? No, pues parece que ya debemos cerrar. También por el tiempo, no sin antes agradecer nuevamente a Laurence Deschamps-Laporte por su generosidad, desde luego, en compartir el día de hoy los hallazgos de su investigación. I think your research sheds light into important and persistent questions about how to activate normative paradigms in foreign policy, and it also helps us think differently about the possibilities of feminist foreign policy. Sin duda es un tema súper importante y crucial para entender desde otro ángulo la igualdad de género, la seguridad humana, el desarrollo y también con la ética, ¿no?, en relaciones internacionales. Muchísimas gracias. Gracias a todos y a todas. No dejen de seguirnos en redes sociales y mantenerse pendientes de los próximos encuentros de análisis crítico y plural sobre los principales ámbitos de transformación sociopolítica nacional y mundial. Muchas gracias. Gracias, Laurence.
Muchas gracias a todos para esta discusión que estaba muy inspirada. Inspiración. It inspired me very much
Nosotros también.
Continue this research. So I thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Bye.
you very much. Goodbye.
Ciao.
Buen día.